Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Raoul Wallenberg Lecture at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. I am Anya Sirota, Associate Professor and Associate Dean of Academic Initiatives here. And it brings me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, the Feminist Architecture Collaborative, or more succinctly known as F-Architecture, a New York-based collaborative founded in 2016. Virginia Black, Gabriel Prince, and Rosanna El-Hatib are the savvy tripartite force behind F-Architecture, self-described as a three-woman architecture research enterprise aimed at disentangling the contemporary spatial politics and technological appearances of bodies intimately and globally. Their collaborative efforts have taken a breadth of forms, including temporary installations, exhibitions, performances, activism, writing, and research-based projects, each grappling with intellectual and political subjects often evaded in architecture or veiled by the orthodoxies of power relations. Blood, phallocentrism, sovereignty, orifices, cultural fixations, even frightening subjects like teenage dreams make their way into the body of this work, posed as legitimate subjects of public discourse. In this process of exercising design's agency through a range of evocative and extra-disciplinary methodologies, the collaborative shines a light on normative gender politics in architecture, and for all the right reasons, makes us blush. Since launching F-Architecture, Black, Prince, and El-Hatib have been extremely busy. Winners of the 2019 New York Architecture League Prize, they've exhibited at major international venues, including spaces in Beirut, Prague, and Singapore. Last year, they were artists in residence at the lab at Darat al Funun in Amman, Jordan, and their writing has appeared in critical journals, including the Harvard's Design Magazine, e-flux Architecture, Real Review, and Log, among other publications. They've also exhibited in institutions, including the Morgan Library and Museum, Studio X Amman, Universität der Künste Berlin, the FRAC Centre-Val de Loire, and UN Habitat. This collaborative met while still pursuing their studies in the MS in Critical, Curatorial, and Conceptual Practices in Architecture program at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Black, Prince, and El-Hatib hold prior degrees from the University of Michigan, the State University of New York at Buffalo, and the Illinois Institute of Technology, respectively. As a student at Taubman College, Virginia Black traveled to France for a research project with me, and I can personally attest to her wry and productively wily sensibility, which has left an indelible mark. So it is for these reasons and for many others that F-Architecture's work is befitting the Raoul Wallenberg Lecture series, focused since 1971 on the exploration of architecture as a humane social art. As you might know, Raoul Wallenberg is among the University of Michigan's most illustrious alumni. He's remembered for his acts of courage and selflessness in late stages of World War II, when he salvaged the lives of tens of thousands of people in Nazi-occupied Hungary. The Raoul Wallenberg Lecture was initiated in 1971 by Sol King, a former classmate of Wallenberg's, and an endowment was established in 1976 for an annual lecture to be offered in Raoul's honor. Finally, the format of this lecture has been developed with support from Taubman College's academic initiatives team, which, despite our current disembodied and socially isolated reality, seeks to create collective experiences that inspire and that bring us together. The lecture will be followed by a discussion moderated by Natalie Fox, a student in her final year of the undergraduate program at Taubman College, who is currently in the Wallenberg studio. And we look forward to that conversation, so I hope you'll join it. And with that, no further ado, please join me in welcoming F-Architecture.
Welcome to our bedroom, a site of recuperation, planning, and primordial teenage rebellion. We're delighted to be here with you and here in this digital boudoir with each other. Thank you to Anya for the introduction and to Taubman for inviting us to deliver this lecture and on a theme that feels so a part of the DNA of our practice. We felt that this was the most appropriate site from which to tell you how we came together and explain what If Architecture is: an architecture office, a feminist collective, a CCCP sleeper cell, a shared alias, an outfit we wear simultaneously, a fake temple to the feminism that architecture forgot or never had, which makes it easier to narrate the work that we do, here from bed and from elsewhere. And by inviting you into this more intimate space of our practice, we can perhaps say a little about what this kind of intellectual and emotional relationship means to us.
Under the covers, we'd like to articulate a sense of resistance that is immediate, interpersonal, and shared between us, just as it is attuned to the systems of power which are difficult to breach, especially as individuals. Our coming together in resistance is a way of providing the support that makes a certain kind of political and precarious practice possible. But to be honest with you all, it's fucking hard to do work that is classified by us or others as critical work that, for some, seems like an excess of what it is to be an architect. Something that seems too much like writing or yelling or art, which is fine, but literally no one is paying you to do it. So the story of F Architecture is necessarily a story of surviving in New York City after we left Columbia, where we met and fell in love. We were trying to figure out what it looks like to have an activist or political or critical or feminist spatial practice in one of the most expensive cities on the planet. Who can afford to do that work? Well, not us, but we managed to do something, and we should start perhaps by recognizing the privileges granted to us by our advanced degrees, our working partners, our freedom from dependence, and our physical ability to hustle and suffer and put work out into the world. Next, please.
Fortunately, we had an institutional affiliation to exploit. Columbia GSAPP was a major tenant of the New Museum's incubator space at the time, New INC, and we applied and were accepted to produce and somehow monetize this research we had proposed around the design of the hymen. The desk that we rented for $200 a month served as a center of operations for this thing that was coming together in real time. But mainly it was a printer to abuse, an address, an air of legitimacy, a few resources we could leverage to do something, anything. Fred Moten and Stefana Harney have said that the only possible relationship to the university today is a criminal one. Students, please enjoy putting that theory into practice. Stealing from the institution that regulates you, that claims to be a place of enlightenment, if not labor, is a way of being in it, using it as refuge or resource without succumbing to its regime of credit and thus debt, its measures of productivity, and the ethics of professionalization. Where New INC had become an extension of Columbia, we found ourselves using the institutional frame to make space for that which necessarily undermines its claims to authority and exclusivity. And while we have since published critiques of the incubator and startup culture at large, we are less interested in projecting a criticality against that which benefited us, but distributing access to those very benefits, keeping the door ajar, opening the space for other kinds of practice, the possibility of resistance, even when it means biting the hand that feeds, or the hand that at least provided the coffee. Next slide.
Okay, so resistance to what? Perhaps we should just lay our cards on the table, because one of the most disappointing things to see in this discipline is when architects pretend not to have politics out of some perverse idea that architecture is somehow apolitical. Next slide. Our resistance is directed to, first, a condition of capitalism that makes it impossible to survive outside of one's appearance in an extractivist, dehumanizing market. And with that, racial capitalism and white supremacy, that long arc that has fashioned this present in which racism and fascism feel somehow new again, more urgent matters rather than the fabric of our world and discipline. The past and presence of settler colonialism and the occupation of Palestine, the persistence of cis hetero patriarchy, and you know what, architecture too, in the way that design, the practitioners, and the built environment accommodate and sustain these compounding conditions of oppression. So we think a pertinent question is, in the way that architecture serves capital, is it possible to design a practice that works against these power structures? What are the ways of working, the interceding artifacts, devices, and scripts that allow for survival under and subversion of such truly busted circumstances? And can we configure other realities from this mess with sharper critique and greater care? To what degree must the work be directed against architecture itself? And finally, can resistance be activated as a mode of practice? We're not so sure, but we have at least been putting some forms of resistance to work. Next.
The first 3 projects we did were essentially protests, but they were organized simultaneously and in close succession and in what felt like constant movement. So next, let's go to the train. Primarily, that movement was just hauling our asses around New York between the Brooklyn neighborhood where we had triangulated to be close to each other and our shared future, and New INC, where our office was, plus approximately 26 coffee shops in between. We spent a lot of time on the train, waiting for the train, missing the train, moving furniture and exhibition materials on the train because we didn't want to spend our pooled funds on a car. But we were also maintaining collaborations on other continents, projects that would locate us in Ecuador and Jordan at the same time. So we think of the train as another space of planning, a figure for being in transit, a way to get somewhere for the low, low price of $2.75 or as cheaply as we can. Next.
F Architecture was born in the magical year of 2016, which perhaps explains a lot of what we've said by way of introduction. And while we were scheming a kind of feminist practice that might be able to work against the exigencies of peak girl boss era feminism, when the Me Too moment appeared to be the most actionable and visible in the highest registers of power, in the largest companies and institutions, and the least meaningful for people who experience the exploitation and abuses of everyday workplaces, the architecture office included. All the cultural power accrued by the white suits and corporate feminists amid the Hillary fervor of the 2016 campaign cycle had been suddenly deflated by a more immediate and obvious object of critique. We ended up working at the outset of the Trump era, which in a way forced us to react not only to a more extreme political entity, but also to a wellspring of reactions to his taking office. After the election, everyone seemed to be looking for ways to #resist beyond participation in the election, which had elicited many thousands of I voted selfies, the evidence and reward for having done one's civic duty. Next slide. We were interested in the aesthetics of political participation, but also of this new regime, which was, as we know, extremely tacky. The surface level luxness of Trump branded interiors meant to distinguish the dynasty as very rich, perhaps in contrast to his populist base, for whom the TV oligarch embodies a kind of white American aspiration. All of that imagery and staging was actually within the realm of appropriation. We could take it, reproduce it, and use it as dressing for another kind of political speech. Next. So we designed a set featuring the wallpaper you saw behind me that borrows some Trump details from his New York penthouse and actually incorporates his own peachy visage. Taking Trump not as a leader, but as a flat layer in the bad decor of the new presidency, we devised this deployable installation that we called #ICalled, a media apparatus that could see new performances of political speech. Literally, it was a set where you could call your senator and film it to post to social media. Next slide. The set was complete with furniture we found on the street and spray painted gold, some of which you saw floating around the train car earlier. We literally had to pack them in to transport to 3 different venues where we staged the installation between Election Day and the inauguration and after. As protest armature, its deployability was essential. It could be made to appear where it was needed and for people who might not be able to participate in the ritual of voting. Next slide. We first installed this public interior in a vacated American Apparel at an event with activists and community organizers, then at the New School on Inauguration Day, and later at the Morgan Library with the Municipal Arts Society. And the videos you see here are a compilation of some of our callers from those events. One interest of this project is how the power of aesthetics, in addition to the power of space and occupation, might be appropriated to exert discourses against powers historically formalized by architecture, the penthouse or the White House. As an architecture of and for protest, the set appropriates signifiers of power to occasion, amplify, and recirculate the will of the people against the whims of the CEO or our former president. Next slide.
So as 2016's USA was debating whether to maintain its polished veneer of democracy or sand it off to reveal to us and exacerbate what we already knew, I flew to Amman, Jordan's capital city, to execute a project that began as my graduate thesis at GSAPP. There, we lingered in cheap cologne-laced bureaucratic halls to realize another kind of embodied demonstration in Jordanian urban space. Next slide. In Amman, we occupied public space to give voice and power to those often denied that privilege. Our project, Republic of Body, was a kind of two-act performance that the first act sought to hack a bureaucratic maze, and that culminated as a final choreographed declaration march that took place on one of Amman's popular streets. Next, please. Part ritual procession and part gay pride parade, the event, which was modeled after royal processions, instantiated a public and symbolic space for feminist and queer artists in the city to assume a visibility they are otherwise denied. This republic was conceived of and by precarious bodies who unveiled their spatial autonomy in the schema of Jordan's nation-building narratives, and by redeploying symbols of power of the Hashemites' kingdom of Jordan. Symbols which in turn were borrowed from the colonial residue of the British Mandate. New performances, customed by the multi-symbolic objects of this layered history, are enacted by Republic to disrupt a gendered national inheritance. By appropriating these mimetic symbols, the members of Republic can express the intersection and mutual construction of queer, Arab, and gender identities, as well as assert their rights to space and legitimacy under a persistently masculine hegemony over the public sphere. Next slide. So just a quick recap of the history of Jordan under the current state. The Emirate of Transjordan, a British protectorate, was established in 1921 by the Hashemite family, the House of Hashim, who hailed from Saudi Arabia. Jordan remained under official British control until its quote-unquote independence in 1946. However, it wasn't until a decade after that that complete British withdrawal took place. Next, please. With riffs on the uniform of the Arab Legion and the Desert Patrol, all designed outcomes of the British Mandate of Jordan, Republic asserts itself as part of that constructed narrative. So here you see an early Arab Legion uniform designed in 1933 by the British officer John Glubb, who was a major figure in crafting the aesthetics of the Jordanian army, and who also saw himself as a kind of father figure to the Bedouins and a nation that he has regarded as primitive before British intervention. And if you want to learn more on that, please see Edward Said's Orientalism. These days, you can find the uniforms in royal ceremonies and also donned by the British patrol at tourist sites like Petra. Next. The sovereign symbols we analyzed and appropriated in Republic are drawn from a timeline that traces Jordan's early years, where the Hashemite royal family asserted its own sovereignty and integrated itself into Jordan's de facto narrative. They historicized the country's traditions, emphasized themselves as direct descendants of prophetic truth, so descendants of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, and assumed their rightful place on the throne of Arab nations. Therefore, they produced and embodied the essence of Jordanian people. And here we trace the claim of prophetic lineage by the Hashemites, where the only woman visible is Fatima, Prophet Muhammad's daughter, the conduit and vessel through which they are able to assert their holy descent. What the nation state attempted to do here through its highly constructed narratives is create a kind of ideal Jordanian citizen. If not a blood relative to the descendants of the most prolific figure in Islam, then those allowed full admission into nationhood are symbolized by a heightened and performative masculinity that does not readily accept any other form of belonging to a place. So women, queer people, refugees, and those without a neatly packaged claim to the nation state often find themselves existing outside of the domain of subjectivity. Next. Prior to the final performance of Republic of Body, we engaged in an image-making exercise that put the production of the nation under scrutiny. So in this photo series titled Tanassol, or Disclaimer, the femme body takes central focus on public steps of Eastern Amman, the most historical part of the city. And here you see the private ritual of bloodletting made public. Next. In this exercise, we redeployed the artifact of the pith helmet, the one you saw in an earlier slide. The nation here and its sovereign symbols appear in photographs which stage them at the scale of the body that interrupts the state's corporeal narrative, highlighting the instabilities and constructed histories of it. So these archival and visual investigations prefigured the final march that took place at the edge of the economic divide in Amman. Next slide, please. But to enable any of that, the project was also an intense bureaucratic exercise that involved seeking permission for a kind of public event that had not yet occurred in the country. In the span of 6 months negotiating Republic, we made over 11 trips to various divisions of the municipality around Amman. The public forum, this year-long research and curatorial project, would assume ultimately dependent on a permit, a verbal agreement, a piece of paper, or a WhatsApp message directing us to an office where we could obtain it, but where, once again, it was delayed for closer examination. This was an important step to ensure the safety of the artists marching on the street, but it was also a performance in its own right, an entry point to scam the system in a way, instrumentalizing the discomfort of being women, particularly younger-looking ones, who are often undermined by older men occupying these municipal offices. We drank the tea offered by someone insisting he's like an uncle to us, all while concealing the critical backbone that formed our application. And ultimately, we were granted verbal approval just 2 days before the performance was scheduled. And two police cars escorted us in the parade. Next slide, please. So the performance paraded bodily armatures carrying local feminist and queer performers as they assumed visible orientation on the street. Through the exploitation and queering of state power symbols, Republic staged a temporary space of visibility for bodies that are often denied that. Next slide. Here you see the queer artist Mohammed Al-Tayyib veiled and externalized by their accusatory soundbite. Next. Shireen Talhouni embodies the materialization of the elusive modern Arab woman who otherwise only exists on virtual stages. Next. And the Jordanian shmagh, or scarf, takes on the femininity it is denied. Now we'll play a quick clip of the events that happened that evening.
جسد مرتاح يا نظيف تخت زلمه يا زلمه 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 عن جد انك زلمه 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 قطن يخت عليك منبوذ يا زلمه منبوذ يا زلمه ضايع 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 في التخت زلمه 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 عن جد انك زلمه يا زلمه 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 مردودات الضمير سمت البدن يا الله خرا يا زلمه 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 في الموت 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 في التخت زلمه زلمه زلمه
Next, please.
So representative bodies was an occupation of F architecture and the Achimamas, or midwives, of Amupakin at the UN Habitat 3 conference in Quito, Ecuador. With these Amazonian Quichua shamans as collaborators, we designed official appearances across multiple formats, including an act of peaceful protest, a publication, a conversation, an act of live drawing, and a space of economic exchange. This also required registering for official conference IDs, which entailed inventing Gmail addresses for the 8 women and coordinating the logistics to actually get them to Quito. And all of these were efforts to assert the image and presence of an Indigenous rural identity. So in 2016, in 2016, the year we graduated from CCCP, UN Habitat approached its 40th year of operation and proclaimed its intention to create a new urban agenda in Quito, Ecuador. Following my thesis work, where I commissioned drawings and interviews from Amupaquin and recorded their knowledge of the rainforest, I'd hoped to continue to work with them to find ways of sustaining their practice and speaking about their work to a Western audience, which was a part of their project at large. Amupaquin originated from a governmental grant to support the integration of Western medicinal practices with Indigenous medicinal practices. And so this birthing center was built, which houses trained doctors and also midwives. And because of the position most midwives occupy, they're also shamans, spiritual and physical healers, and they use the space around the physical building to grow plants and create medicine. This becomes a kind of learning garden for tourists and volunteers seeking to learn about rainforest practice. Next, we considered whether or not Amupaquin, who operated within a spatial framework outside of the UN's definition of habitat, might want to attend and offer their suggestions regarding the making of the city and its impacts on the rainforest. More than anything, this could be an opportunity for them to speak about their practice to a global audience and potentially attract financial support. So we applied to design an exhibition space for the conference where we would formalize Amupaquin's presence among national governments and NGOs. In a series of drawings, we proposed to communicate Amazonian political life as expressed through the not exclusively human design and construction of the rainforest alongside the representatives of the new urban agenda. Next. So to zoom in on this agenda for a moment, we worked on a publication that considered how Indigenous sovereignty in Ecuador and its governance models might be considered or figured within the bureaucratic landscape of the UN, particularly as expressed through UN Habitat. And of course, we found them to be largely left out. While the agenda claimed to prioritize recrafting habitats for those rendered vulnerable by situating the urban or the city as the primary space of investigation, it failed to incorporate the ways in which the very extraction that fueled the city perpetuated violence to rural areas, causing Indigenous people to move to cities and to need assistance from governmental systems outside of their own. So this is not a new critique. As we know, the city isn't just a spatial configuration that supports diversity and multiculturalism. It's also an accumulation of wealth, often produced at the expense of those living in its extractive zones. Thinking habitat through city may invite critiques of bureaucratic governance and the ways it prioritizes white life, but it can't fundamentally alter it. And so the UN Habitat Conference, reflective of the UN's broader multinational globalist approach, marched in lockstep with Western ecological ideologies, where the city becomes the spatial, legal, and social organizational system that will carry humanity safely into a new sustainable future, and the dense configuration of people within it, whose rights to live are equally respected, becomes a false way to protect the natural by separating people from it. And this ignores the fundamental fact that much of Indigenous life, particularly in Ecuador and for the women of Amupaquin, is a life lived within the rainforest. And so to be forced to leave that life is a kind of violence. Next. And so this model city is a kind of biological or biopolitical city, one of necessity, built upon the logic of Bretton Woods and the finances of the World Bank, which we diagrammed here. It's a hierarchical, vertical city in which economics, politics, and participation are also hierarchical and vertical. Thus, the city produced by and for capital is somehow also figured as the savior of those problems it produced. Next. And so, of course, development is not only spatial, but political. How can you even speak about Indigenous agency without talking about rights of land and rights to land? So the cover of this publication features the Ecuadorian Constitution, which was written in Quechua as a part of a governmental mandate in 2008. The Constitution called for the implementation of Suma Causai, a Quechua term that could be roughly translated into beautiful living. And it's a concept of life organized along a lateral political field of action involving interspecies engagement and mediation. It's a subject-to-subject politics with social, economic, and legal implications that extend to non-humans. It's not an agglomerative scheme where a majority desires surface. And so it became important to make visible all the ways the form of the city is multiplied to reproduce a politic that cannot accommodate something like sumac calcite. Next. So this diagram shows the small percentage of programming at Habitat allocated to rural issues. And here we were also interested in revisiting all the forms in media, documents, photos, event statements, news releases, exhibitions, pavilions, and libraries through which UN Habitat reproduces the city, simultaneously a production of invisibility for those other habitats, forms of social and political organization, sociality, and creation of environment that fall outside of this framework. Next. And ultimately, this thinking resulted in a model of extreme economic exclusion. So following our proposal for Amu-Pakin to occupy a booth at Habitat, we received an acceptance letter. Amu-Pakin could present and sell their work from a booth priced at $400 per unit, but the unit was not a booth, rather it was a square foot. And as a reference, some penthouse apartments in Quito can be rented for around $400 a month, and midwives make $15 a month. So at that price, we ultimately couldn't be accommodated by the UN's preference for the urban, which essentially priced out the people who were least represented there, exactly the circumstances that incite protest. Next. So we divided the few funds we'd raised to getting them to the capital in Quito so they might assert their own presence outside the organizing logics of the exhibition as a delegation of Amazonian Quechua women. So just to go a little into their risk of speaking out, a huge part of this project was to understand what forms of visibility and ways of speaking could accommodate the specific kind of risk that the midwives had to confront. To speak against the government who funded their organization following a summer of political unrest the year prior was not an option. While, as you've seen, Correa's government ran on a platform of inclusion of indigenous peoples, even citing Sumac Calci along Buen Vivir, its platform for the good life, it had been actively punishing dissenters and bribing and extorting indigenous leaders and politicians. Next. And so a part of the project was to see what was possible in terms of representation, of being seen and heard, but minimizing the risk of retribution or violence. Because the women are shamans, they performed cleansing rituals on conference participants, occupying the space despite not being allowed to participate otherwise. And you can see them offering this to one of the UN Habitat attendees. Next. And in order to capitalize on their appearance in the city, we wanted to make an opportunity for them to sell their goods, which they sold in a park and also in an event at a local art museum called Arte Actual. And then next. And then thinking through their appearance within the infrastructural space of UN Habitat amidst the white tents that house the exhibition space and reinforced a bureaucratic notion of life, we hoped that by appearing in their traditional dress, the midwives might disrupt the space's function and to offer a kind of knowledge not present there. They received a lot of attention, but it wasn't the kind that we'd hoped would sustain their organization financially or grant it the kind of support from the international community assembled in Quito. So one woman commissioned a $300 necklace for Maria Antonia, and then some of the men from the Archidona government, which you see here, the local government in the city where they live, found it necessary to pose with them in an uncomfortable manner, and other ambassadors took photos with them and prevented them from moving freely around the space. Next. So Adela Alvarado, who you see here, then president of Amu-Pakin, was interviewed by the Evening News and wanted to speak in Quechua to presence indigenous language in the national media. But the news program totally removed her voice and spliced Georgia Innes's voice, who you see here, who's the anthropologist we collaborated with, They spliced her voice over it. So on the program, she wasn't even acknowledged as the president of Amopakin, but rather as a Quechua grandmother. And so even as the midwives arrived in Quito with great knowledge of cultural, medicinal, and spatial practice, as those appointed within their communities to guard and disseminate it, their appearance was subject to misinterpretation and their knowledge to a kind of erasure. Next. Each of these events are shaped by performances of various kinds, challenging us to design appearances that also allow for material needs to be met. We want to ask, what skills do we have as designers to shape the ways these appearances are received or understood? And so we attempted to collaborate with Amopakin in the ways that we could as organizers, enablers, stagehands, etc., as resistance entails this kind of dedicated support. Next.
So that was a lot of traveling. And to be honest, doing this work and trying to raise money to make projects that we wanted to pursue is actually quite exhausting. So let's return to the bedroom where we can take a tiny rest. But now we can also draw your attention to the Princess Nokia poster on the wall. So during this time, our first year in practice, we were also writing a lot. And at some point in early 2017, we were approached by Harvard Design Magazine to contribute a text to an issue that they dedicated to the teenager. Next. Which we happily used as an opportunity to intellectualize our fandom for Miss Destiny, Wavy Spice, the Princess Nokia. But it was also a point at which we were able to sharpen some ideas around political futures, collective dreaming, and productive unreality. For me, this piece was primarily written and edited from a laptop in a bed in my parents' house in California, where I was caring for my mom while she recuperated from a cerebral hemorrhage. Writing through a kind of teenage resistance when I had reactivated in some way a surreal version of my own teenage experience, inverted to care for my mother. Writing served as a tether to Virginia and Rosanna, an anchor to the work that we were still doing, and the support network that we had formed that was so accommodating of the leave of absence that I had to take from our lives together in New York. So again, I want to emphasize the really embodied and effective way that resistance and care are bound together in the fabric of our practice. Perhaps something of that lives in the voice of this writing, both sensitive and flippant and clawing at the possibility of being more than what bounds you like four walls, however plastered they might be with vision board cutouts of art and hotbods and other places to be. Thinking through dreaming and fantasy was also a way to evaluate the fiction of the state and the business of the powerful that is often presented as the real, the authoritative, the only logical way forward. So very counter to the fantasies of teen dreaming. Fortunately, people read Harvard Design Magazine, including Cedric Falk, then a junior curator at the Nottingham Contemporary. He's now at the Palais de Tokyo. And who, after reading our piece, successfully lobbied to have us join the curatorial team in devising a multi-act exhibition around feminist resistance. Next slide.
So Still I Rise, Feminisms, Gender, Resistance explored the role that women have played in the history of resistance movements and alternate forms of living. Coinciding with the centenary of women's suffrage in the UK, we wanted to see resistance across the world from a multiplicity of viewpoints, from the domestic sphere to large-scale uprisings and spanning the late 19th century to the present. Next. Still I Rise, Feminisms, Gender, Resistance explored the role that women have played in the history of resistance movements and alternate forms of living. Coinciding with the centenary of women's suffrage in the UK, we wanted to see resistance across the world from a multiplicity of viewpoints, from the domestic sphere to large-scale uprisings and spanning the late 19th century to the present. Next. So we have works from artists including Joan Jett Black, Judy Chicago, Zenobia Bailey, Kiara Fumai, who you can see in the mirror, Jala Wahid, to name just a few, and photos and objects from key historic moments, including the Civil Rights Movement, resistance against dictatorships in Latin America in the 1960s to 70s, independence movements against colonial rule in Africa, the women's liberation movement, the AIDS crisis, and the Stonewall Rebellion. It was planned to have slightly different stagings at 3 institutions in the UK, the Nottingham Contemporary, the De La Loire Pavilion, and the Arnolfini in Bristol. We situated the content of Still I Rise, the speech acts and echoes of many women across space and time, in and between zones of action, declaration, broadcast, and reproduction. Mapped onto the different galleries of the 3 buildings, these conceptual zones created spatial relationships between the artworks and ephemera on view, but also set out to accommodate the exhibition visitor in a meaningful way. Components of the Design Institute, points of access that receive the body to bear witness to both a history of feminist action and to reflections on the political present. As designers of the show's exhibition infrastructure, but also the spatial organization of many histories of resistance and contemporary artworks and artifacts of feminist organizing, we proposed a series of body-scale wall niches as aggregations, indicative of the crowd or the collective. Over the development of the design, those became large and small curved walls, freestanding and able to be reassembled in the successive acts of the show. Fabric covered, plastered, wallpapered, or covered with steel mesh, embedded with retractable curtains to change the space for events and other gatherings, we introduced a material palette to the curved partitions and niches that took cues from the works they supported, or provided a softness where necessary. Moving from the figure of the home to the street, we thought about the orality and echoes of past protest chants, thinking in terms of volume and diversity of the messages of resistance. We sought to give space for listening, hearing each other, and speaking out together. To quote the Guardian review, "When Still I Rise is said in unison, a future without patriarchal hierarchies starts to appear, a future that still requires artistic imaginings for us to see it." The work and reception of Still I Rise and its successive chapters was ongoing, while we were also doing the research we'd set out to do from the beginning on the design and virginity of the clinical spaces of feminine bodily modification. So we'll have to get back on the L train to take us to New York, where we were manifesting a thing called Post-Fortis Hymen Factory, and then to Beirut, a diversion from the main event of Rossana's raucous Palestinian wedding, to visit the concentration of plastic surgery clinics offering vaginal rejuvenation and hymen reconstruction services.
This is a series of projects we've talked about a lot in other places. So we're going to give you the high-speed tour of this set of connected landscapes, where the cultural production of virginity and gendered notions of honor meets a kind of bodily belonging that underlies the construction of the nation, particularly, though not exclusively, in the Middle East and North Africa. The train is going to take us to Beirut, to Prague, back to New York, and to Singapore and Milan. But really, we're visiting the project of virginity construction. Where in the world is the production of virginity? It's a question that required constituting and inhabiting, and remaking all of these spaces where the hymen circulated, where this part of the anatomy is made to take on a visibility and a currency in the world. Next, please. Our research began by mapping that exchange between body and market, where something called the artificial hymen, the virginity pill, a suppository, or the hymen rejuvenation kit was invented in Japan and is now primarily manufactured in China. Cool. These products are distributed through European and North American retailers to women in and from the MENA region. Next, please. Of course, hymen simulations have a much longer history than the Alibaba era of discrete online consumption. But the continued desire for such a product and the niche industry's willingness to service a longstanding cultural norm gave this bodily ideal contemporary expression, complete with YouTube how-tos demonstrating insertion and on a fleshlight. Next, please. So we were interested in these objects within a larger universe of virginity products, which we also mapped conceptually in what we called a cosmology of hymen artifacts. Next, please. The artificial hymen, whether made available as a suppository or dissolvable film, still belong to an economy of bodily modification that includes surgical options, the most expensive intervention. That took us to Beirut, a MENA capital of surgical tourism and the manufacture of Arab pop star beauty.
Mapping the geographic distribution of the clinics, like the very expressive Dr. Nassar Hospital or the boutique stylings of the not yet built hotel clinic of Dr. Nader Saab, we started to assemble what we called the Metaclinic Map. Next, please. It was a reproduction of connected interiors that we had visited in Beirut, the spaces dressed to accommodate the desires and pressures placed on women. Next slide, please. Sorry. In each of these projects, we navigated the tension between material artifact and the affective dimension of virginity culture, and by reproducing what we were finding in our fieldwork. Through drawings and designed environments, we engaged in larger conceptual investigation of what it means to represent the set of conditions without placing undue pressure on the body and choices of Arab women. Next slide. Instead, we scrutinized the idiosyncratic designs of the interior environments where hymenoplastic services were rendered. Next slide. Like that of the aforementioned Dr. Nassar, whose eponymous hospital included thematic suites for recovery, a classic suite or one for a rocker girl, as he says. The suites have everything. Next slide. The suite was represented by us in an exhibition put on at Gallery Viper in Prague, where we installed reconstructions of the clinic amalgam, including hymen objects that might be worn or applied as perfume, sat in like a chair, rolled out like a rug, such that the hymen itself, something designed, becomes part of the design space of the clinic or lab where it's made and remade. Next slide. We also fashioned our own reception space in the exhibition, akin to the waiting rooms populated by women who would sit next to each other without speaking really, and while Lebanese fashion television played in the background. Next slide. And the third space in our reproduced clinic environment, a room for self-examination, where a chair allows you to recline and see yourself in a curved mirror below. It's one that builds on a tradition of women armed with hand mirrors, specula, and the know-how published in feminist women's health center pamphlets to perform at-home examinations and what they called menstrual extractions, aka abortions. Next slide.
These reconstructed spaces were outfitted with furniture that we designed, but that we also appropriated from open source 3D model sites, sometimes happening upon the very same furniture we found in the clinics we visited. Next. And with that, we produced another level of access to the exam room, the VR component of the show. So as you are reclined in the self-exam chair of the exhibition, you also see up from the stirrups of the virtual exam room, where surgical tools float above your head and you hear the voices of others in your ear, narrating their own experiences with such a procedure. Taking this research into the space of the exhibition involved tackling key questions about representation, especially as we focus closely on intimate operations on the body. The VR scene is one that heightens a sense of proximity to the embodied vision and intimate experience of another, and not just the void of the user that VR assumes, but in our case, the position of actual women who had undergone these procedures. In trying to design a kind of sensitivity to the experience of another, we also have to understand the limits of empathy, that it is impossible to know that experience, but it should not prevent us from seeking an ever closer kind of understanding. To transition to another related project, perhaps it's helpful to start with another protest image, one that we tried to get close to understand in part by performing its potent bodily action. Next slide.
In 2011, there were a series of actions against the Lebanese nationality law. At the time, the Ministry of the Interior was considering rewriting its code to relax the qualifications for citizenship. But there was still a question if Lebanese women could confer their nationality to their children with non-Lebanese partners. In Lebanon, as in 25 other nations globally, citizenship is conferred patrilineally, meaning that your father must be a Lebanese citizen in order for you to be one. One of the actions organized by the Women's Nationality Partnership in Lebanon involved a demonstrative blood-giving action, where in ambulances outside the Interior Ministry building in Beirut, women had their blood drawn and demanded it be tested for its, quote, Lebanese-ness, as it's somehow different than their fathers and brothers. There was something absurd in offering one's biomaterial, one's blood, up as evidence of nationality. And the performative aspect of that demonstration was so powerful in conveying the disparity between one's own being and the national apparatus that classifies being. Next, please. We found this act so compelling, so powerful, that we reconstructed the performance of giving blood as part of a live image that brought together other artifacts and gestures that speak to intimate relations to citizenship. So this exercise was the foundation of our contribution to Al-Majhula min al-Ard, or Uncharted Land, curated by Noor Akkawi for the Biennale of Architecture in Orléans, hosted by the FRAC Centre-Val de Loire. The commission was to prepare 2 large-scale flags that would be raised along the Rue Jeanne d'Arc in Orléans. Our flags, alongside those from other architects and artists, including Ala Younes, Idris Waddahi, MTL Collective, Design Earth, and even Zaha Hadid, would represent radical spatial imaginaries from the Arab world that were anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, and feminist in their orientation, though I don't know if that applies to Zaha. An alternate translation of the title Al-Majhula min al-Ard is She Who Has Been Disappeared from the Earth. And it's one that resonated with a line of inquiry we were opening about the categories of non-belonging produced through the law under the terms of jus sanguinis, or right of blood. I'll just say for now that jus sanguinis serves as the conceptual ground for the rest of the final project we will present tonight. Next.
It began in earnest, as our work often does, through writing on the topic. We had occasion to contribute a chapter to a book called Transient Spaces, and a related piece that appeared in an issue of Thresholds on kin. And it's also not disconnected from our work on virginity. In 2018, we were presenting that research at Studio X Amman, and while we were in the city, we arranged an interview with Dr. Maysoon Toom, a sociologist at Jordan University who had done research on honor killings. She had theorized the social constitution of the Arab body politic, specifically in rural Jordan, where women were figured, as she said, as extricable limbs of what she called the extended body. A shame-producing act, like premarital sex, could compromise the moral health of the social body at large, and women were frequent victims of policing bodily honor. We started to pursue the extent to which the law had and continues to uphold this kind of familial violence in Jordan and elsewhere, and found that it was only one extreme expression of the uneven protection of women in the frame of the law as citizens or not. Next slide, please. In producing this live image of the way that women find expression within and beyond the nations that do not permit them to reproduce their own citizenship, we aim to move away from the production of evidence of one's proper belonging and instead perform the embodied relationships between women and the state that are capable of resisting the flattening of national identity to a national symbol like the flag. Next slide. So on this Haussmann Boulevard in Orléans, of all places, we flew this testament to another kind of belonging, work that would, by the end of the same year, take residency in Jordan. So with that, we will transition to Amman.
In December of 2019, one of the last times we went together anywhere really. We returned to Amman as artists in residence at Darat al Funun. Next, please. Amman is where I spent most of my childhood and my angsty teenage years, and our reflections on the passport holder necessarily dealt with the array of identity documents that constitute my own attachment to Jordan, but also my late father, my mother, and our lives in Palestine and in states of exiles from it. So part of the work we did in Amman was archival, literally reopening my father's old briefcase and uncovering our life story through a faded paper trail. It was ethnographic, involving workshops that where we asked others to bring in their own objects that secured a material and symbolic attachment to their lives in Jordan. And it was forensic, involving going around the city and locating the offices that grant specific documents that authorize residency, validate identity, secure access to work or services, or certify marriage, birth, and death. Next, please. Our projects focus on the passport and associated documents that attest to one's citizenship, residency, and official existence is rehearsed in Tabarbur in Amman at the Civil Status and Passport Office, one location of several municipal offices across the city that grant documents. But it's sometimes hard to tell where to go. And the reality is often that you show up and wait in line with all your paperwork, and then when you get to the window and they tell you to go somewhere entirely different. It's like a bureaucratic labyrinth that does not make itself immediately legible to the documentary subject. And we were immediately interested in the spatial displacements and the process of retrieving the thing that allows you to pass. So literally here in the frame of the gallery, you see me renewing my Jordanian passport, where Gabrielle and I spent like the better half of that day. Next, please. The body who belongs is not enough. Rather, bodily claims to territory and nationality are mediated by a world of artifacts, biodata, paper documents, scanners, and other physical interfaces between people and governments. The governing apparatus does not always recognize its subjects on the appropriate side of a line projected onto sand. Belonging to the nation is an experience through materials. It wears on the body. Next, please.
In that way, the identity document is a mediating device, one that enforces rather than constitutes one's belonging and exclusion. It is also designed to express and enforce particular attachments to the nation. Small semantic differences in the ways documents are designed can reveal great differences in power. For example, the Jordanian national ID card is replete with imagery of state heritage. Petra is a decorative layer in the background. It's something that's more obvious when compared to the flat yellow ID designed for the children of Jordanian women, a recently invented non-citizen category. In November of 2014, the Jordanian government enumerated specific privileges, or mazaya, that would allow these families to access healthcare, public education, driver's licenses, and the ability to own property and businesses. These provisions are understood not as a right, but as a privilege granted by the government. But as of 2016, only the provision for equal access to healthcare had been implemented, and still years later, some institutions will not recognize the card. The family book is also another document that expresses patriarchal power relations, ratified by the nation. The husband and father appears first, and pages follow to enumerate the first wife, second wife, and so on, and their respective dependents. A clause at the end of the family book states that women who are married to non-Jordanians are not entitled to list their own children. Next. The outcome of the residency was a solo exhibition in the lab at Darat al Funun, but its contents would be driven by 2 workshops we conducted in the gallery. The first of which we asked participants to join us in operating on the text of the law directly, asking them to redline printed copies of the text of the Jordanian Constitution, its nationality codes, as well as personal status laws, which regulate matters of marriage, divorce, custody of children, and legal matters of guardianship, or wilaya. Our claim is that the law is designed, as much in writing as it is in practice, as it can be imposed on flesh and verified in blood, And so the act of editing the text allowed us to scrutinize the language and also to see the text as plastic, something made that could be potentially unmade. Next. We also asked participants to bring their own artifacts of belonging, identity making, and material tethers to the nation. These included old and new passports, family photos, souvenirs from places traveled, a diary, an iron, a framed copy of a Kurdish millennial's UNHCR documents that affirmed his refugee status. While there was certainly an attachment to other material objects as meaningful anchors to family and practice, the document remained a fixture of these conversations. Next. And we also designed a counterfeiting operation so that participants and exhibition viewers could produce their own documents, appropriating the Jordanian passport as a substrate to introduce other pertinent identity information, the ingredients to remain anonymous, a photo if they choose. Next.
If you haven't noticed, we have an attachment to fakes across our work, but there's a way in which the counterfeit document refuses the authority of the ID rather than attempting to reproduce it. The fake dissimulates the original without assimilating its symbolic function. Next slide. We conceived of the exhibition as a way to present what we had documented in Jordan and on the contemporary reality of use sanguinis elsewhere in the region and globally, but it was also in a way a fake passport office, something that allows opportunities to interface with those conditions of power that root through the nation and to see them as mutable and to render that encounter with bureaucracy less alienating and perhaps more agential. Next slide. So these are some photos from the opening in January 2020. And like in the workshops, we designed a situation in which gallery visitors could take a selfie in the gallery, compose a photo ID document, modify that existing template, and stamp it with a custom stamp we made. We also collected and presented alternative artifacts of belonging related to the 25 nations that employ some version of jus sanguinis and their citizenship laws. So that's what you're seeing in the red room with the FRAC video in the back. Next slide. And we also had occasion to represent this show in Vienna at Magazine Gallery, which we did entirely remotely last fall. A very strange experience. So on that final note, let's head back to bed.
It's not just from our bedrooms, but also from our commutes, Zoom windows, day job offices, the offices of corporations and of universities continuously remade as corporations, that we resist and dream resistance. The struggles are entangled between what's personal to us and our working toward a collective future. And in seeking a future for F architecture, we're dreaming of something that can endure. And with that, thank you. And please visit our mirror for questions.
Thank you for having me in your bedroom tonight. My name is Natalie Fox, and I'm a senior in the Wallenberg studio, and I'll be asking some of my own questions and bringing in questions from the YouTube chat. But first, I want to thank you all for the inspiring lecture.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for having us, and also welcome to our virtual bedroom. We're very excited to have you be our magical mirror and conduit to the outside world and YouTube. Excited to see what everyone thinks.
If it's all right with you guys, I'd like to start with this question from the undergraduate Wallenberg Studios. Many of your projects discussed today are installations or performative protests that are explicitly impermanent. How do you see this as an act of resistance to the more traditional definition of architecture? And how does this subvert the way that architecture has upheld systems of power?
That's a wonderful question. I don't know, I think, sorry, did somebody else want to go? Virginia?
Yeah, sure. Or is that okay with you?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So I think we wanted to say that there is an architecture office we love some distant godmothers, I guess, which is called Liquid Incorporated. This is something Gabrielle wrote about. So working in the mid-90s, they formulated these really wonderful architectural experiments that set out to deny the formidable masculine ethic of structural performance. They made columns that worked in tension, privacy walls that revealed the body, which was a really transgressive approach to canon. But they also worked through exhibitions, which perhaps limited the scale of the work. And it was an effective way of putting work into the world and some of the only opportunities that we've had to realize our work and give it a public life.
But also, just want to speak to the temporality of our projects, which are at times the most appropriate ways to work and for some of this work to exist. So you saw in our first 3 projects, which one was a deployable site of protest, one was intervening into an exclusive space, and the other one occupied a street. These are all temporal in nature, and they speak to a very specific moment, or otherwise they might risk their efficacy or even possibly, not happen. And, for example, in Republic of Body, really like over planning it or making it something that is permanent is literally impossible. So then you have this process of documenting these works where then they live on as archives, and that becomes something that mediates between the lived moment of these projects and then the way that they're able to be digested by us and our audiences, and the way that they're represented years to come. So they live on in different ways.
And I think there's also something interesting about emancipatory work that requires it combust. It's reacting to forces of power, these kinds of vectors that are constantly shifting. And even though the mechanisms of power might be robust, they still are evolving. And so in that way, they're not as permanent and stable as they seem to appear. And the reasons that architectures of power have to last is because they're constantly having to construct and reconstruct ruling relationships. So our tactics have to change in the same kind of moment-to-moment way. And also, I think if feminism ever worked, we wouldn't need it anymore. And, that's clearly not the case right now.
Great, thank you so much. Then Amelia Lind asks, could you speak more to the power of presence of non-men in colonialized or politicized spaces? And what attitude can designers take to empower this demographic?
I mean, I feel like that's a question that speaks directly to Republic of Body. Rosanna.
Yes, it is a very good question. I think, as designers, or at least specifically for that project, it really was about presencing them on the street, despite all of the risks that were inherent to the project. There is also, as a designer, my role was to kind of set the stage to make sure that the design itself doesn't pose any kinds of risk that are more immediate. That being said, the artist kind of understood some of those inherent risks that I spoke about, and there was a kind of consensus, but there is a lot of power in placing a kind of presence for people or a kind of body that is deemed as one that does not belong or as one that needs to not be visible publicly. So at least for that project and for those, few minutes, it really maybe it was like 20 minutes of them marching down the street, there was this kind of inverse of power that happened, and the dynamic really shifted. And I think as a designer, that was our role, is to kind of set that stage properly and really have them be able to express themselves in a way that they feel empowered and not feel like, they're again kind of being threatened in any way. That is my answer.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a follow-up question to that, and it's similar to it's a similar theme, but in finding new projects, how do you go about ensuring intersectionality and uplifting voices that you feel are underrepresented?
Well, maybe we can react to the kind of trivial part of your question, which is about finding new projects. I think the way that we come to do work is less about sort of prospecting for a new thing to do, but really pursuing something that feels like it needs to be addressed critically, that could use the tools and the skills that we actually have to leverage. But often I think it's also something that we get like so obsessed by and just can't avoid addressing. Like artificial hymen, it gets stuck in your head and you can't do anything but work on it, or it literally disrupts your life, or kind of reveals a way forward that you have to sort of move toward. But I think this question about ensuring representation and intersectionality has to do with maintaining a critical relationship to our own expertise and experience, which we know is always partial. And I think maybe one way that we do that is in writing, and that's often a matter of citation and practicing good citational practices. Sarah Ahmed has this line that I think of all the time about building feminist shelters with your writing, where citations are sort of like bricks. They build the walls of your feminist shelter, and so you don't want to build your walls with the ideas of sort of exclusively white men, right?
Yeah, and sorry. I just want to say that it's also about, continuing to form and maintain collaborations with people whose work resonates with us, and also whose relationship to are meaningful to us, both on a personal level, but also in the work that we do together. So for me, at least, it has been a lot about maintaining my own tethers to my home, the people that have been inspiring me with their work from over there, the way that they've been resisting in various systems of power, and especially when those systems were trying to silence them. So being able to work with them as architecture and continuing a kind of relationship with them, it's been really a gift.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk about collaborations coming out of pre-existing relationships so that projects can remain sustainable and then the relationships can continue to evolve. And I think it's also about trying to have an increasing depth of knowledge about the people that you're working with. And to use this just to speak about Amu Pakin, how I've learned and if architecture has learned from people who are trained to assess the needs of a community or to listen to them in a particular way. And I think we want to just increase our capacity to sensitively respond as designers and activists.
And this question from Chandra Bernath Plastid is kind of into what you were talking about with the collaboration and things. And we're just wondering if you could talk more about how you connect with potential partners and movements and protests that you have worked with in the past and that you are continuing to work with now.
I mean, I feel like that's another good opportunity to talk more about Amu Pakin and your time in Ecuador. Virginia?
Yeah, actually I got a grant from University of Michigan to study Quechua in Ecuador. And then I spent like several summers there, and a part of that field school was going and like visiting different organizations. And so Amu Pakin was one of these. And then some of the people at the field school were trained as medical anthropologists, and they I just stayed in communication with them, and then it kind of turned out that we were thinking about how Amu Pakin might start to position themselves and gain more visibility. And so we started to try to figure out how our skills could work toward whatever goals they had defined. So I think it's, I guess, being around projects that you think are meaningful, and then seeing if the people working on those projects happen to need you. And that's kind of how it worked out.
And to wrap up, and before I do, I just want to say thank you again for joining us today and letting me into your bedroom. I just wanted to ask you, as the theme for this year's Wallenberg Studio is resistance, what would be your advice to students and young people that want to make a difference in terms of resisting the current systems of power?
Yes. I don't know. Can we offer advice? Are we qualified?
Yes.
I think it's important to recognize when you can say no, when you can refuse, but literally utter the words no. I think a lot of people have too much to lose in order to refuse, to speak up. And it's important to be conscious of who can afford to do that, who can afford to refuse something really untenable like bad working or living conditions. So it's a consciousness of who's around you immediately, and in relation to these sort of larger conditions that you want to tackle. But I think you can be really crafty in that when it's impossible to flat out refuse to walk out to sit in the office of the president of your university to demand the thing that you need. And I think we saw that with this like recent Reddit takeover of the GameStop thing. We don't have to talk about that at all. But I think there are ways of being really creative, of putting your perhaps creative thinking to use that is not for the benefit of some kind of profit-making scheme, but can really rub up against and disrupt larger, more formidable systems of power.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I wanted to talk about the relationship between resistance and exhaustion, which is something I've been working on recently. Maybe I need to resist exhaustion more. But in trying to put effort toward that kind of acknowledgement and learning about yourself and about supporting others and being able to notice when they need that kind of support and have kind of overworked themselves in a sense. And it makes me think of when I was in Ecuador making this documentary on the protest movements, and I was able to speak to a lot of indigenous activists there who'd been working, and this work had been going on in their families for generations. And they were talking about how it requires this patience and sustained effort, and also to realize that it's the work of a lifetime and many lifetimes. And I think I still haven't learned that, but I think I'm trying to live in that sense of time.
I think maybe one last thing is to also make sure to organize, whatever you want to do, it's way more effective when you do it together and form a coalition with other groups. So, pull in your resources, take the subway like we did in the beginning if you don't want to, exhaust all of the resources, and, distribute the privilege and recognize your privilege and then distribute it and put your energy into something that, feels truly mutual. And I feel like that should also distribute maybe some of the exhaustion. When you're doing it alone, it's all going to be on you. But when you're doing it together, at least that's also kind of equalizing the field. And then there's a lot more energy to go around. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you three so much for talking to me today and for the lecture. And with that, I will take my leave in the magic mirror.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Go to bed. I said it. Do we leave?